Hi Y12. So this is the first video on A Small Female Skull by Caroline Duffy. This is a poem which kind of dovetails with the last one in the sense that there's feelings of kind of contemplation of life, sense of regret a little bit, so it does have similarities to The Captain and Biographer. And also back to nostalgia as well, because it's kind of taking a bit of a look at life and what it means, how you reflect on your experience and what that tells you about your life. So starting with the title, Small Female Skull. So we'll deal with the adjectives to begin with, and then we'll think about what skull could represent. So small female skull. We've got two fairly kind of objective adjectives being used there. Not quite not quite factual. I mean, a female skull is factual. Female's a factual adjective. Small is kind of on the borderline. Like, you could say it's factual, you could say it's opinionative. But I'm just going to put adjectives there. They're quite objective. Like, it sounds, by that I mean it sounds like someone's kind of like describing it to put in a museum exhibition or something. It's quite dispassionate, those adjectives. Like a description of the skull. And adjectives. There you go. They sound like something that would be uttered in like an autopsy, so they're quite kind of removed from the idea of the skull being part of the person. It's just being dealt with as an object here, rather than a representation of the person. So it's quite objective. And then the skull itself. So that's female as well. Oh, and sorry, one other thing to add to female before we think about skull. There are the kind of generic associations that you may have with something being female, i.e. it being slightly smaller than that of the male, or slightly weaker or fragile. So you've got these connotations, as controversial as you might find them, connotations of fragility, small size, something to be kind of protected almost. And then you've got the idea of the skull. So the skull is fairly kind of standard metaphor in English literature for death, or kind of conversely for life. Like, we think about the skull as being part of the human body. We also think about that famous scene in Hamlet where Yorick is holding the skull. I'm sure you've seen pictures of that before. Holding the skull and kind of contemplating his life and his mortality. So the skull is a symbol for life and death in those kind of contrary terms. And your mortality, kind of considering the fact that philosophically we're all, well, philosophically and biologically we're all going to die, but also kind of a symbol of like accepting death, looking at the skull and thinking, yes, I both acknowledge and accept that my life is temporary here on earth. So we've got all these things that it might represent: an acceptance of death, her own, I've kind of mentioned it here in connection to the adjective female, but the fragility of life, because a skull is just made of bone. That bone in itself is breakable and fragile, so the idea that life is fragile and therefore precious. So you can get quite a lot out of that title, but these ideas come up in the poem itself, so I won't annotate too much more there. So this video will deal with the first two stanzas. I'll just read down to the end. It's actually going to go over the second stanza onto the third purely so we can get to the end of that phrase without cutting it off unnaturally in the middle. So I'll just read to there just now. With some surprise, I balance my small female skull in my hands. What is it like? An ocarina? Blow in its eye. It cannot cry, holds my breath only as long as I exhale. Mildly alarmed now into the hole where the nose was, press my ear to its grin. A vanishing sigh. For some time I sit on the lavatory seat with my head in my hands, appalled. It feels much lighter than I thought. The weight of a deck of cards, a slim volume of verse, but with something else, as though it could levitate. Disturbing. So why do I kiss it on the brow, my warm lips to its papery bone, and take it to the mirror to ask for a bottle of beer? So this poem is set, if you like, in a bathroom. The persona is female, and she's sitting on the loo and she's holding her head in her hands. And metaphorically, she's kind of holding, because if you're holding your head in your hands, you're holding your skull technically, aren't you? So she's imagining when her head's in her hands, she's imagining that image of like holding the Hamlet image of holding the skull. She's imagining that she's doing that, and she's kind of contemplating her life. And she's contemplating the fragility of her life as brought up at the top there. And she prefaces the entire thing with this adverbial phrase, with some surprise. I balance my small female skull in my hands. So there's a sense, it is with surprise that she does the act of holding her head in her hands. So this adverbial phrase suggests that the speaker is taken aback with her own mortality. Perhaps this is quite a humbling moment where she's holding her head in her hands and she has this realization that she is not invincible, that her life is temporary, and she isn't as powerful as she thought she was. And we get that through the idea that she's surprised that she has this small female skull, this fragile life. So the speaker is taken aback. That was the phrase I used, wasn't it? Taken aback by the kind of lack of power, I suppose, that conveys, the sense that you have to ultimately accept that you're not infinite, you're temporary. And she balances her skull in her hands. I think that verb balance is interesting. It suggests like quite a tentative, careful manoeuvre, doesn't it? If you balance something, you're doing it quite carefully. It suggests like some thought, some skill almost. So that verb does suggest that she's being tentative. She is afraid. The voice is afraid to be contemplating life in this way. Therefore, it's being done with great caution. So tentative, afraid, cautious. Just add that in there. So all things that we could say with poetic voices. And then she starts this kind of series of comparisons for like what her skull is like. So she says, what is it like? An ocarina. An ocarina is like, I had to look it up, I'm not going to lie, like a woodwind instrument that's got holes in it. So the comparison there is, and if you look it up, do like a Google image search, it kind of looks a little bit like a skull in the sense that it has got holes in it, and it's made of terracotta, so it's quite fragile. So that comparison underscores the sense of fragility. But these kind of repeated questions, what is it like, an ocarina, show that she really is reflecting. She doesn't know, she's questioning what life is, because the skull is a metaphor for life. So rhetorical questions, she's questioning life. She doesn't have the answers. So you could make a comment there about the poetic voice being, in fact let's just do it there, uncertain. And then she says, it cannot cry, holds my breath only as long as I exhale. Mildly alarmed now into the hole where the nose was, press my ear to its grin. So I want to pick up this mildly alarmed. So she's exhaling in a way that suggests mild alarm. So that adverbial phrase again picks up the one from the first line. and shows that this sense of like questioning and uncertainty is kind of turning into fear and panic at the realization of the temporary nature of life as she sits with her head in her hands. And that is kind of symbolized by this, the description of a sigh as vanishing. So there's a sense in it vanishing, that verb, that she is on the cusp of death, or that she is, or it's symbolically showing how quickly life can be taken away, and therefore it vanishes in the blink of an eye. So that's really emphasizing the temporary and, I suppose, unexpected nature of death. Now that, not temporary nature of life, unexpected nature of death. As in, we don't always see it coming. And then she sits, we kind of get the setting now. For some time I sit on the lavatory seat with my head and my hands appalled. And I'm going to pick up again another, this time an adverbial phrase of time. Mildly alarmed and with some surprise are adverbial phrases of manner, but this is an adverbial phrase of time. And we get the sense now that she's quite isolated up here on the loo, because she's sitting there on her own, holding and contemplating. And that adverbial phrase can kind of symbolise the passing of time and how she's contemplating death, contemplating her life, kind of realising all the time that has passed. Often when you contemplate death, it's part of a wider contemplation of your life and how things have changed and how you have changed, your circumstances have changed. And that for some time could be kind of more symbolic, not just that she's been sitting on the loo for some time, but that she is reflecting on the time that has passed. So the speaker is reflecting on time that has passed. And keyword there is reflecting for your AO2. And this image here, the idea of sitting on the lavatory seat, is supposed to be an illusion as well. So I suppose just sit. And this is another one you might have to do a Google search of, and you'll know what I'm referring to when you do. There's a famous statue called Rodin's Thinker, or The Thinker, I'm not sure. And it's that picture of that man sitting, and kind of he's got like a knuckle under his chin, and it's like a pose of like stereotypical thinking. And lots of people have kind of alluded to the fact that the way it's sitting, it looks like he's sitting on the loo. So this is a reference, an allusion to The Thinker. And it's showing that what the persona is doing is kind of reflecting philosophically on life. And the stage that they're at in their life. But what's interesting is that they sit on the seat, they reflect, but they say at the end that they are appalled by the way that they sit and reflect, or they're appalled at what they've reflected upon. So that adjective is quite dark, really. The idea of reflecting on life, some people have said that so lots of Duffy's work is kind of semi-autobiographical, and Duffy's recorded the fact that she has dealt with depression on and off throughout her life, and the image of being like isolated upstairs, later on down it talks about people downstairs there. So there's like symbolically, there's like everyone else who's all together, and then she's alone and isolated. So it has a kind of darkness to it, this image of her being on the loo alone. So the fact that she's appalled at what she is reflecting upon suggests like a similar kind of self-loathing and self-critical poetic voice that we saw in the biographer and in Captain. You know, people that look back on their life and are really unhappy with what they've reflected on. So self-critical poetic voice, similar to those ones that we've seen. And that is kind of supported by this next description. It feels much lighter than I thought. So the idea that she is holding her head in her hands and symbolically weighing up her life, and then her conclusion is that her life is not as heavy as she thought, suggests, kind of symbolically suggesting that she's not, done as much in her life as she might have hoped, she hasn't accomplished as much, it's not as full and therefore not as metaphorically heavy. I'm going to do a little star down there. So that adjective phrase, much lighter, is again supporting this idea of her being very self-critical, and also similar to biographer and Captain, is kind of disillusioned by what life has come to. And then she chooses a couple of descriptions that she's comparing the weight of her skull to: the weight of a deck of cards, a slim volume of verse. Now I've deliberately not asked you yet to think about anything, because I'm kind of, as you can tell, trying to just move on relatively quickly to the end. But this comparison is really interesting. I'll say something about it, but it would be worth you spending some time thinking about as well. Why compare her life to a deck of cards or a slim volume of verse? Now, my interpretation of a deck of cards is that she's saying something about, to me it's a symbol of how the way your life turns out being a lot to do with chance, and the idea of chance being linked to games and gambling, that you're in control of your life to some extent, but to another and maybe a greater extent, it is dependent on the cards you were dealt, dependent on where you were born, the time you're born in, your sex, your race, etc. All of these things that are down to chance. To me, that's what she's saying here. So, a symbol of chance, and almost therefore it's a way of the poetic voice getting out of these feelings of disillusion and self-criticism. But actually, it was just life is the weight of a deck of cards. It is all down to chance. And then she says, but something else, as though it could levitate. So she brings in a kind of supernatural description of the skull here. The skull levitating is also reminiscent of Hamlet, but compounds for me that sense of fear that comes through in mildly alarmed, and in, where else is it? In the idea that she's appalled with what she sees. So this verb suggests to me fear. And indeed, sorry, that's just, I was going to annotate that beside disturbing. It's the same as disturbing, isn't it? She is disturbed by the concept of how unsuccessful her life has been, and indeed disturbed by the concept of death. And then she says, so why do I kiss it on the brow, my warm lips to its papery bone, and take it to the mirror to ask for a bottle of beer? So reading right down there so we get to the end of the phrase. Papery bone is an important noun phrase because it really compounds the image of I know I've repeated it, but it's important, the fragility of life. Something that is papery is light and not very robust, easily torn or broken, much like the bone itself, much like life. And then she says, so why do I kiss it on the brow? If I am disturbed by the concept of my death, why do I cling to it? The kiss on the brow is an image of kind of tenderness. So she's wondering, if I am abhorred by the thought of this, by the act of reflecting on my life. Why am I doing it? And then she says, so why do I take it to the mirror to ask for a bottle of beer? Now, I'm not going to lie to you, I find this quite ambiguous. So Bottle of Beer is a album by a band from the mid to late 1970s. To me, when I read this, I hear a mispronunciation of bottle of beer. So slightly avoided this because I'm just not sure what I think about it. So when I think about the rest of the image, I think of the idea of the mirror, and that presumably symbolic of reflecting on things. You're looking in the mirror, you're looking at yourself and reflecting on your life, and you're unable to look away. When you look in the mirror, you're seeing the truth reflected back at you, aren't you? So I would encourage you to think a little bit about this for yourself. I'm afraid I don't have too much to offer, but the mirror I definitely see as a symbol of reflecting on life. And again, it's that question of, well, why am I doing this? Why am I reflecting on my life? Why am I embracing this thing that I find disturbing and I find appalling? So she's unsure why she's drawn to it. And I suppose lots of people are drawn to the idea of death, even though it's something that is generally considered quite frightening. Okay, that is the end of video 1.